Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. A couple of weeks ago, Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles met with the new US Secretary of Defence Pete Hegseth in Washington. Hegseth told Marles that President Trump had already demonstrated that under his leadership, you're going to have no worse enemy and no better ally than the United States. After this week, many Europeans might disagree.
In order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are.
Trump administration officials met with their Russian counterparts and began working out how the war in Ukraine might end, without America's traditional allies in Ukraine or in Europe.
President Trump went on the attack today against Ukraine's President Zelensky. In a social media post, Trump called Zelensky a dictator without elections.
And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
As we've discussed many times on this show, Trump isn't anti-war. This isn't about building peace, but about Trump's usual grift. We know who he is. He keeps telling us.
I want them to give us something for all of the money that we put up. So we're asking for rare earth and oil, anything we can get.
But that doesn't mean Trump is abandoning Europe. He might be pulling the rug out from under NATO and throwing the Ukrainian people under the bus, but he and his surrogates are still very much involved in European politics. As they work out a deal with their ideological ally in Putin, they're also busy supporting the return of the far right in Europe and strengthening the links between the MAGA movement and parties like the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party that just won more than 20% of the vote in the German elections. This is the kind of ally and enemy Trump's America is. This all has big implications for our own region. There's long been a big push in the United States for a pivot away from Europe towards the Indo-Pacific, where the United States sees itself as engaged in an existential great power competition with China. That's playing out right now in the Trump administration, where some high-profile figures like Hegseth are arguing for the prioritisation of China over traditional allies in Europe. To help us figure out what this all means, this week we're joined by Dr Gorana Grgić. Gorana is an expert in transatlantic security and diplomacy, based at the Centre for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. She's also a non-resident senior lecturer at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and a non-resident senior fellow at the Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council. It was recorded on Thursday the 20th of February Australian time, a couple of days before the German national elections. Here's Gorana now. Gorana, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you again for the invite.
No, it's our pleasure, especially when I know that you've probably had a particularly busy week, given what's going on. So we might start there and just ask you, especially for listeners who are struggling to keep up with the avalanche of news, how these talks in Riyadh between the United States and Russia came about and why Ukraine was excluded from them.
Well, this was part, of course, of the great announcement that Donald Trump made already during his campaign that he would end this war in the first 24 hours from getting in the office.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order. And it will take me no longer than one day. I know exactly what to say to each of them. I got along very well with them.
And it didn't take quite 24 hours. It was more like 28 days or something along those lines. But certainly what we've seen happen since, and actually in the lead up, has shouldn't have, I would say, surprised as many people as it did, but it's certainly the kind of pace and just the sheer sort of change in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to its previous support for Ukraine and its stance towards Russia. It has turned things right on its head. What we've seen with this Riyadh talks is basically a kind of exercise in great power politics at the expense of anyone who doesn't have nuclear weapons or, at least a couple of 100,000 troops ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. And in that, of course, Ukraine has been completely sidelined, and everything that has been happening ever since in terms of the kind of flurry of either social media posts by Donald Trump or these sort of statements coming out of the administration really makes us think that we are now seeing a complete sort of U-turn, 180 in terms of U.S. policy towards Ukraine, where, again, Ukraine is not given any agency over its own fate. And of course, there is a lot more that's being asked from Europeans who, at the same time, again, don't have a seat at the table and a say about any kind of design or architecture of what this potential peace deal might look like.
And do we have a clearer sense of what that deal might look like, what the result for Ukraine might be?
We currently don't have anything that's concrete. We've heard a lot of things being thrown around by way of saying that the kind of maximalist goals in terms of, at least from the Ukrainian side, and those would be reinstituting control over all of its borders to go back to the kind of status quo ante to 2014, prior to annexation of Crimea, prior to even the war in Donbass, not just what's been going on since February of 2022, that this is something that the US no longer supports, but this is something that was already said last week when Pete Hegseth was, as the defense secretary in Europe at the NATO Defense Ministerial. So that there is, of course, some sort of thought that there is going to be territorial concession that's going to be imposed on Ukraine, basically, whether Ukrainians want it or not. And then everything else in terms of the kind of mechanics of how this would be done and sort of the way that this would be governed as any kind of peace deal are still up in the air. But another thing in terms of not just what's going on the ground, but politically and diplomatically, of course, the kind of change of stance with Americans now signaling that there is no future for Ukraine to be in NATO is another part of this sort of deal package. And what we see, of course, is that on these terms, it's Russia really that's setting the agenda and that's dictating how this would go on.
Yeah, and I mean, you've mentioned what a shift this is in the US-Russia relationship, which has been coming for some time, but is quite a dramatic shift, from Soviet-US relations to where we are now. I mean, how significant do you think that change is? And do you think this is a kind of Trump temporary phenomenon, or do you think this is a trend towards a more closer relationship?
That's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought a bit of history in, because actually, if you look at the post-Cold War period, which I don't know now where we would put where it ends, what sort of paradigm we live in. Are we in the post-Cold War and so on, and where it began, where it started? But what has been quite significant in terms of the US-Russia relations following the collapse of the Soviet Union is that almost every single US president, bar Biden actually, attempted some sort of reset of relations with Russia.
First, the United States recognizes and welcomes the emergence of a free, independent, and democratic Russia led by its courageous president, Boris Yeltsin. Our embassy in Moscow will remain there as our embassy to Russia. We will support Russia's
going to basically the kind of time where it was Bill and Boris, or it was Bush and Putin, and then again Obama and Putin, and then again Trump and Putin. We see the sort of the kind of frequency here of one particular president appearing there. And actually, when we had Joe Biden come into the office, there wasn't so much of a concerted effort to reset relations, but basically to establish some sort of guardrails, to talk about strategic stability, to bring some other issues on the agenda, not necessarily just connected to arms control, and nuclear armament, but also cybersecurity, because this was particularly front and center around the kind of early days of the Biden administration. And what we see now, truly, again, in just the first month of Donald Trump being in the office, is, I would say, a reset like no other, because it wasn't a mandate. There wasn't any kind of concession on part of Russia to be given actually to get to the negotiating table, right? Normally we talk about things like getting to the negotiation table as a kind of goal that would be conditioned by doing some things, kind of, this would be a carrot, right, that would be dangled, and Russia changing its behavior in order to be, again, legitimized and seen as a kind of interlocutor that's worth having across the table. What we've seen now is basically no preconditions for talks, actually seeing Riyadh talks, I would say, more through that prism of US-Russia reset or normalization, rather than necessarily talking about how do we get out of Ukraine, right, and how we actually get to some sort of then constructive point from which we can negotiate. It was more about determining how US and Russia would reciprocally now get their diplomats back into the countries, even talking about some new economic and investment opportunities, things that sound like there is absolutely nothing else going on, right? And we can just talk a little bit about diplomacy and economic exchange. So in that sense, I would say the change that we've seen just in a matter of weeks vis-a-vis Russia's standing in the broader sort of ecosystem of US foreign relations, it's really quite something. And again, noting that there are still significant sanctions, that, the president of Russian Federation is someone who has an ICC warrant and so on.
It's wild, isn't it? Do you think the significance of that shift is being recognised in Europe? You mentioned, of course, that Europe has been completely excluded from these talks, even though they've been demanding a seat at the table. How are European leaders responding to this?
Well, they have responded with alarm and shock, and I would guess rightfully so on one end, but also at the other end, it is kind of surprising to see so many of European leaders being so surprised, right? Because again, the writings were on the wall. It's not like Donald Trump wasn't talking about these things, but I think that there was some sort of, nice stories we tell ourselves to go to sleep kind of more at ease, to say, well, Trump in the first term wasn't all that bad. I mean, look at what he does rather than what he says and so on, right? The list goes on. But I think it became increasingly clear over the course, again, of Pete Hegseth's NATO Defense Ministerial, J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference.
It's okay to be proud to be German. This is a very important principle.
Speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. And trust me, I say this with all humor. If American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk.
We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. There is no replacement for hard power.
So these things were just kind of 2 days apart. And then again, 2 days later, we had the Riyadh talks. And this kind of unfortunate trifecta meant that Europeans truly now live in a different universe where the United States, which is still de jure an ally, right? Part of the NATO alliance, still Europe's major trading partner, someone that Europeans always highlight, is connected to the old continent, not just because of the military and political and diplomatic links or economic links, but also that's part of this shared sort of values community, now really start talking a completely different game. And of course, it's no surprise that given all of these changes, there was an emergency summit that Emmanuel Macron, president of France, summoned on Monday at the Elysee. And rather than seeing the kind of show of European unity, and I'm speaking here as a European as well, as a sort of dual citizen, but, truly as a European, to see then all of these leaders, and it was only about a kind of just less than a dozen parties that were invited actually to this kind of dialogue, that they came out and that they didn't actually have any kind of strong message of what are going to be the next steps, right? Right off the bat, when the journalists started asking, okay, what are you going to do about, any kind of troop deployments, if this is going to be part of peacekeeping, about part of the kind of third-party guarantees, what's going to happen on that end, you have outgoing German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying, it's premature to talk about that. We don't even want to consider this story. Then to Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of UK, saying we might send some troops, but then we are only going to send them if this is going to be somehow underwritten by the United States or supported.
Yeah, and of course, this is also happening in the context, exactly as you've just started to outline, of European politics and the complexities of European politics. And I'm really glad that you mentioned Vice President J.D. Vance in his speech at Munich in the last week, because figures like J.D. Vance and Elon Musk in particular are playing a pretty large role, I suppose, in European politics in the moment, in that they are courting, even kind of promoting far-right parties in Europe, including the AfD in Germany. How worried do you think, some European leaders are about this? And what is it that you think, people like Musk and Vance are trying to achieve?
Look, the transatlantic links across the sort of hard right are nothing new, right? This was something that we've seen already during the first Trump administration. We've seen it go on during the Biden years, almost contradictory to their nature. They actually cooperate rather well across borders, right? And they've actually just not long ago had a major summit of these various parties here in Europe, with some presence from the US. And again, this exchange goes back and forth. There are Europeans who go to the US and they sing from the same sort of hymn book about, migration being the main issue for Europe, this kind of sense of replacement and grievances, free speech issues, again, the kind of worries that they're being censored, etc. Right? And all of these were actually themes that J.D. Vance brought about on that first day of the Munich Security Conference. Now, in terms of the domestic politics, how this is playing out, of course, you can't escape the fact that Germany is just this Sunday, 23rd of February, going to have elections that have been called early, and where currently the way things stand, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, is polling at the second place, right after the CDU, the Christian Democrats.
The polls have just closed in Germany in one of the country's most important elections so far this century.
The far-right party, AfD, looks set to make historic gains, finishing in second place with around 20% of the vote.
Alice Weidel is the AfD's pick for chancellor, although it's highly unlikely that she will get that job. Weidel and the AfD put migration at the heart of their program, pledging to carry out mass deportations and an asylum crackdown. And they've pledged to lift sanctions imposed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. And they say they want to start importing Russian gas once again.
It is hugely worrying because, of course, if this is happening in the context of election that are going to be quite consequential in the biggest country in Europe, and one that, again, quite ironically, Europeans are looking towards for leadership, right? Then, of course, it is something that, of course, created so many reactions following that speech, and that a lot of the ministers and public officials that were speaking right after Vance sort of ripped their prepared remarks and actually opened by saying, hey, we don't agree with that. And I think one of the notable kind of cases of that was Boris Pistorius, Germany's defense minister.
This democracy was put in question by the vice president in front of all of Europe. He spoke about the annulment of democracy, and if I understood him correctly, he compared conditions in parts of Europe with those in authoritarian regimes. This is not acceptable.
It really, I mean, to me, the way that I at least heard it, it sounded basically like a campaign speech in favor of AfD, rather than any kind of message of anything related to Transatlantic alliance. It was there, it served a political purpose.
I think you're absolutely right. It did seem to me like a campaign speech as well. And it was quite a contrast, I suppose, or maybe it was kind of offset by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defence's speech at around the same time, where he did focus on, some of those harder security or hard power, as he called it, issues. And one of the things he did, and that Vance has done before, is call for NATO countries to increase their own defence spending. Not only are they trying to influence domestic politics in Europe, but they're trying to influence budgets and defence spending, and calling for this massive increase in defence spending as a percentage of GDP. What do you think Hegseth and the Trump administration more broadly are trying to do with these demands?
Well, the way that I read it so far, again, is not unlike, again, a long line of US demands that Europeans need to shoulder more burden, right, and provide more seriously for their own defense, right? And there are different ways you can say that. And again, in the context of transatlantic relations, we go back as far as, the Kennedy administration, even, Truman in the early days of NATO, who were saying these Europeans are not doing nearly enough, right? They should do a lot more. And to which I would say absolutely yes, but also every time Europeans try to do things in a way that would be more harmonious and coordinated, it was actually the US that a lot of time prevented these efforts. So again, if we only focus on the post-Cold War period, right, it was the United States that said there will be no duplication, no discrimination, no decoupling of the sort of US from this European or Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And I'm alluding here to a speech that Madeleine Albright, as Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, gave. So Europeans are trying to do a lot more here. But of course, where do you start? How are we going to decide who is going to focus on what? This has been actually part of a lot of these reports that various usually former Italian prime ministers have actually penned, like Mario Draghi or Enrico Letta, around what actually European Union needs to do in order to be a more credible actor in general, but also when it comes to defense. So things are changing for sure, but they can't happen overnight. And now the question is, what do you do when the US is clearly pulling the rug right under you while you are unprepared.
Absolutely. And I mean, Europe is also contending with all of that while trying to make sense of the Trump administration and what it is doing. And as you kind of alluded to, some people and some governments, some leaders are perhaps better at that than others, better at listening to what Trump says and understanding, what he means by it. But I wanted to get into, if we can, the makeup of the Trump administration and the way it is conducting foreign policy. Regular listeners will remember that we spoke to Matt Duss from the Centre for International Policy in DC a few weeks back, and he spoke about Trump's cabinet being kind of broken up into a few different groups, some of whom he described as prioritizers when it comes to American foreign policy. So these are essentially people who believe in maintaining US primacy, American power, but they believe that they need to do that by focusing efforts on China. So is this, if we kind of zoom out, I suppose, is this what we're seeing play out, that the Trump administration is attempting to kind of manufacture a quick end and a dirty end to this war in Ukraine so that it can step back from NATO, as you've described, in order to focus more on China?
This is the question in terms of where U.S. foreign policy is heading if we are to look at it from a kind of macro perspective, strategic perspective, as you said. And certainly this kind of debate surrounding the prioritization of theaters and how U.S. responds to various crises emanating from, I would say, again, the three main theaters being the Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic, and the kind of broader Middle East is something that doesn't, of course, come just as a function of the Trump administration, but it's something that's been going on for quite some time. And certainly we've seen this play out during the Biden administration. So it's great that you've already sort of mapped out the key characters in this sort of play that's going on, or the kind of the court intrigues going on, and who is whispering into Trump's ear on where U.S. should position itself. Because to me, when I heard Pete Hegseth's speech last week at the NATO Defense Ministerial, it sounded to me like Elbridge Colby, who is the nominee for the now Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, was basically writing these remarks. And what I mean by this is that he is one of the strongest proponents, someone who has been truly vocal, even in the early days of the war in Ukraine, that U.S. should not get distracted, that U.S. should be fully committed to the Indo-Pacific, that this is the strongest deterrence signal to China, and that China is the only power in the world that can credibly challenge the United States, and therefore all the foreign policy priorities and resources need to be aligned with the kind of U.S. being present in the Indo-Pacific, even if it comes at the expense of allies and partners in other theaters.
The Biden administration's approach is very focused on long-term strategic competition, some degree of focus on the military challenge from China, but really, as you can see by their effective prioritization of Ukraine and now the activities in the Middle East, a lot less of an emphasis on building up our military in the Pacific to match China's extraordinary, awing military buildup focused on the Western Pacific. The only prudent assumption is to plan for the very, very, very real possibility of war.
And this is something that, of course, Biden administration, maybe heard, but then said, no, actually, what we need to do is help Ukraine today, because there is this sort of other idea and competing idea that reputation is transferable, that basically by being credible in one geopolitical context will inform your sort of potential behavior in others, right? And this is how this whole game of U.S. trying to bridge allies and partners from Euro-Atlantic area and the Indo-Pacific area working much closer together. If you think about formats such as NATO and the Indo-Pacific Four, of which, of course, Australia is one part of, but even, initiatives like AUKUS would say that actually there is a value on not losing sight of other theaters, because if you want to be credible in your deterrence efforts, you need to bring partners and allies along. And it's not just about then partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific, but also in the Euro-Atlantic. What we see play out these days is truly the kind of pendulum swinging towards this side of, no, there is no such thing as transferability of reputation. China is not necessarily looking at what the US is doing in Ukraine and kind of thinking, okay, what are the implications for Taiwan? But the line, at least the way that the kind of guiding thought, if you wish, and principles, at least on part of the top policy planners and strategies at the Trump Defense Department are saying we need ruthless prioritization, and we can only achieve, now we can argue about what is it that they're trying to achieve, a victory or, some sort of settlement or whatever it is with China. That's the question, right? What the end goal is. We are still murky on that, but basically we can only achieve that if we allocate all of our resources into the Indo-Pacific, and who cares if we throw under the bus again, long-standing allies. They're seen more as a burden. And maybe if I can add one thing, what I found very interesting is that there is a huge opposition, or at least vocal opposition, among the GOP, among Republican senators who are saying this kind of policy, this kind of direction where we are ruthless about prioritizing the Indo-Pacific is going to cost us dearly. And it's not necessarily because they like Europe so much, but they're worried about the implications for the Middle East. So we've seen the likes of the Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton basically put forward this letter at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee saying that he does not support the confirmation of Bridge Colby as the Undersecretary for Policy. And this is a completely wrong way to go, in a sense. And it is quite interesting to see that at these levels of policy thinking, at least, it's not quite settled yet, that there are rifts within the GOP. Now, whether the senators will ultimately prevail, whether this is something that, again, they want to bring, Trump's ire at the end of the day is yet to be seen. But it does tell us that, at least on some of the foundational debates around how U.S. actually manages its alliances, it's far from a kind of settled story and a consensus.
I think that's absolutely right. And how those ideological clashes and differences and ego clashes and power struggles as well play out is something to watch, not least because it has such huge implications for us here in Australia and for our region. Gorana, I have so many other questions for you, but I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we might have to get you back. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your generosity in what I know has been a super busy week for you. We just appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 20th of February. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can send us feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.